And hi, everyone. This is Michelle Nogales. I'm the Outreach Director for Casa De La Familia.
And I'm Katie Mendez. I am the Social Media Marketing Coordinator for Casa De La Familia.
Casa De La Familia is a nonprofit mental health organization dedicated to helping those who have been either victims of a crime or have suffered a deep psychological trauma. Today, we're doing the first of a four-part series presentations honoring Domestic Abuse Awareness Month and those victims and survivors.
So I'm going to go into explaining just the basic definition of what domestic violence is. Domestic violence is also referred to as IPV, or intimate partner violence, dating abuse, or relationship abuse. And it's a pattern of behaviors used by one partner to maintain power and control over another partner in an intimate relationship. And domestic violence doesn't discriminate. We want to emphasize that. People of any race, age, gender, sexuality, religion, education level, or economic status can be a victim or a perpetrator of domestic violence. And domestic violence includes behaviors that physically harm, intimidate, manipulate, or control a partner to force them in ways to force them to behave in ways that they don't want to. This includes physical violence, threats, emotional abuse, or financial control, which I'm now going to talk about in types of abuse. And when a lot of people think of abuse, the first thing that comes to mind is hitting. They think of physical violence, they think of bruises and things like that. But what we want to emphasize today is that domestic violence is not only physical, it can also be emotional and or financial without having any physical violence at all, but it's still equally labeled as domestic abuse and harmful to the victim. And so emotional and psychological abuse can often be just as extreme as physical violence. The lack of physical violence doesn't mean the abuser is any less dangerous to the victim, and nor does it mean that the victim is any less trapped by the abuser. And so what we know of physical violence and what physical violence is hitting and slapping or strangulation. But it can also mean, and something that might not be as common that we would label as physical violence, but that is damaging one's property, refusing medical care, and also controlling medication or coercing a partner into substance abuse. And then another form of domestic abuse, types of abuse, is emotional. And so this is seeking to control the person, the loved one, by name calling or insulting, blaming the partner for everything. This would be shown by it's always the victim's fault. Even if the abuser started the violence, it's always making it everything that happened the victim's fault, that they made them mad and that's why they got violent. Another part of emotional abuse is extreme jealousy, not just normal jealousy in relationships, but extreme jealousy. Also intimidation, shaming, humiliating, isolation, which could be physically moving away from family and friends, but also forcing the victim in other ways to be away from talking to family and friends. Controlling what the partner does and where they go. And lastly, for emotional abuse, is stalking. And then the other type of domestic violence is financial. So we had physical, emotional, and then lastly, the three main ones, there's financial. And so this is any behavior that maintains power and control over finances that constitutes financial abuse. And so examples include inflicting physical or emotional harm that prevents the person from attending work, or harassing their partner at work to jeopardize their employment. And so the intention of this is so that the abuser can control what the partner to control the partner so that they don't have an independent source of income. And then lastly, controlling financial assets and effectively putting like an allowance on the partner. And so these are the three main types of abuse. They can happen separately and still be domestic abuse. And so emotional without physical abuse is still domestic violence. So if this is, we just want to mention, if this is happening to anyone, it's not their fault. Domestic abuse is not anyone's fault, and they didn't cause this. Typically in domestic violence situations, the pattern that's seen is that the victim is actually taking every opportunity to avoid conflict. Like the definition said in the beginning that I talked about, this is behaviors that physically harm, intimidate, or manipulate, or, which is not and, control the partner and otherwise force them to behave in ways that they don't want to. So typically the victim is kind of suppressing themselves and doing a lot of things so they're avoiding the conflict that the abuser is constantly bringing onto them. And we just want to re-emphasize and say that there is no typical victim for domestic violence. It can happen to anyone, any economic status, any age, any race. And no one, because no one goes into a relationship thinking that it will become abusive. This can happen to anyone.
So as Katie pointed out so eloquently, domestic violence can happen to anyone. If you're a male, if you're a female, you can be victimized nonetheless. And we just pulled up on our screen something that might prove useful in while I'm discussing the cycle of violence. So this is sort of a step-by-step guide to understanding the cycle of violence. It is not easy to understand why this cycle occurs. But as Katie pointed out, it is not only happens in a physical way, it's often emotional, psychological. It can be sexual and financial. And the stages, they don't all happen at once. It's usually not done at the same way each and every time. It may take a few days to go through this cycle, or it might take up to a whole year. And therefore, it can be very hard to detect that the abuser and victim are in this vicious cycle that's very hard to get out of. And the longer the cycle happens, the more the victim loses their own sense of self-worth, sense of perspective, which is why, coupled with denial, is why oftentimes the victim will stay in the relationship. It often is set off, as you can see at the bottom of that chart, under an acute explosion. So for example, something is being said. The abuser might verbally abuse or humiliate the victim. They may beat the victim, harass them, abuses the children, perhaps the pets. Objects are thrown. So something usually that is a major incident. Again, it doesn't always have to be physical, but the response of the victim will be that they want to protect themselves in any way they can. They might try and reason or calm the abuser, or they may or may not call the police. They might leave, they might fight back, or they may go into that mode where they just simply freeze. So again, there's that fight, flight, or response mode that any survivor is trying to cope with this trauma that is they are experiencing. And oftentimes this relationship in the beginning did not start this way. So again, it's not the victim's fault, because in the beginning, we'll kind of move to that honeymoon phase, is where it all begins. And oftentimes what occurs shortly after the acute explosion, shortly after, maybe a couple of days after, maybe minutes after. And that is that honeymoon phase can be, where the abuser is apologizing, saying, oh, it won't happen again. It was because I was drinking, gives so many different excuses, blaming something else or even the victim, but really tries to sweeten the situation, buys gifts, maybe brings flowers, is really trying their best to control and manipulate that victim yet again in believing the good person they are. And the victim's response, well, they might set up counseling for him, thinking, well, I'm the only one who might be able to fix that individual. I shouldn't say him, it could be him or her, correct? So they might just think, well, if they started any legal proceeding or law enforcement came to the house, maybe undoing what they've already said or what they've already divulged. Because in the end, the victim might want very much the relationship, simply not the abuse. So this is a forgiveness period and sort of a new honeymoon phase. And that's why it's often referred to as that. So the victim can feel happy, hopeful, relieved, and this will last for a certain amount of time until the tension starts to build again. And that tension phase can often be one of the longest portions of all of the phases on this particular cycle of violence wheel. So with the tension building, that abuser will be overly sensitive. They start nitpicking, yelling, withholding affection, maybe is giving the silent treatment, or starts to put down or insult or shame the victim, humiliate them in front of loved ones, friends, family. These are just some of the examples that oftentimes the victim experiences. And the victim's response to that, of course, as you can see here, well, again, trying to reason, trying to be calm, trying to satisfy, say, oh, you know, I can be everything you want me to be, right? Jumping through hoops to try and calm the situation down, because the sense is that, you know, more abuse and more conflict is not what the victim obviously wants. And so oftentimes there's that avoidance. The victim can withdraw, tries to be as nurturing as possible, but nothing ever pleases the abuser. They just want more and more. So sometimes that attention and that over affection that the victim is giving is simply not enough. And as that tension builds, the cycle then sways again into an explosion. And so it is with this cycle, this perpetual cycle that goes on, where it's difficult for the victim to see clearly, because they so clearly believed, and they so believed in the sincerity of the abuser during that honeymoon phase, that even when the tension starts to build, there may be that strong sense of denial on the part of both the victim and the abuser that this person can't be this way. I just saw them treating me so well. It's that love bombing phase that's so difficult to understand. How did it go from that to this horrible behavior and manipulation and control and cynicism, downright to being quite abusive? And some abusive relationships in that acute phase can be very, very dangerous and sometimes lethal. And so it sort of brings about the question oftentimes, right? Like, well, why does a victim stay? I think a lot of people have heard that who might be in a domestic violence relationship, or maybe even one who may ask themselves, and so why do victims stay? Well, victims, you know, it could be a lack of knowledge of what domestic violence is, or even access to even any kind of safety or support. Oftentimes we, you know, consider our friends and family that support system. That may not be the case for all victims. So because there is no one to go to or to help them, that might also be a reason why the victim stays right where they are. It also might be a lack of means to support oneself financially, a fear of being homeless, or having the victim think that, you know, the relationship, okay, you know, is a mixed bag of things, you know, taking the good with the bad. But the bad is a series of manipulation tactics, extreme control, harm, mixed with that love bombing, that love, that feeling of hope where dreams have been realized. And oftentimes victims stay because perhaps it's against what their family thinks one should do, perhaps when they're married, or even certain cultural views of staying in the marriage no matter what. And also the victim may also feel that they're worried for their kids losing custody of their children, or leaving their children behind, or their pets behind, to become further victimized. So all of this plays in of why a victim may stay. Perhaps they have reached out to law enforcement or another entity of some sort of organization to help them, and the response wasn't what they were hoping, or they just didn't feel that they got very far. So there can be many different reasons or a combination thereof. So that brings us to the question that victims often experience, which is, why does a victim stay? Well, there can be many different reasons. It can even be a combination of different reasons. First of all, through that cycle of violence and the patterns of domestic violence, one can see very easily how the victim can sort of lose themselves, if you will, lose their sense of judgment and become very, very confused. What is the right thing to do? That victims simply lack, the knowledge or access to safety and support. Fear of losing custody of the children, or fear the abuser will hurt the children, lack of means to support their self financially, fear of homelessness, and a general feeling that the victim may have that this relationship is just sort of a mixed bag of things. It might have the love and the hope and the dreams simply coupled with those other negative things, but the negative things are very extreme, and they're a consistent escalation of abusive behavior, which can include the manipulation and control and the just pervasive feeling of being intimidated. And the victim oftentimes will just not simply know what to do or who to turn to. Oftentimes, they may feel isolated or threatened and cut off that support system, which can actually help them. I'd like to go over just a few statistics because they're important to bring out. And this is based off of the national statistics reported from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And that is that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 9 men will experience at some time of their lives some form of physical violence by an intimate partner. And women, even between the ages of 18 and 24, are most commonly abused by an intimate partner. But that's not to say that it doesn't happen to those over 24. Abuse could go on for a lifetime, which is why we want to so bring out red flags in a relationship, which we will go over next. And 1 in 15 children are exposed to intimate partner violence each year. So with those statistics, they are pretty staggering. And this is more common than most of us are aware, but it's important to be aware.
So now we're going to go over the pattern of abuse, and I'm going to specifically talk about the power and control wheel. And so what this wheel helps us understand is the overall pattern of abuse and violent behaviors that are used by abusers to establish and maintain control over their partners, both within and following the end of their relationship. And so I'm just going to start at the top and go clockwise, just looking at this wise. And it's a lot of information, so we're just going to read it and go through all of it. And if you'd like to screenshot it, you can screenshot this image. We'll also give you a resource at the very end of this presentation where you can go back and look at this wheel on their website. And so starting off, using intimidation. So this could be making them feel afraid by using looks, actions, or gestures. This could be smashing things, destroying their property, abusing pets, or displaying weapons. Using emotional abuse. So putting them down, making them feel bad about themselves, calling them names, making them think they're going crazy, playing mind games, humiliating her or him, whoever the victim is, as well as making them feel guilty. Next, you see the box that says using isolation. So that could be controlling what they do, controlling who they talk to, what they read, where they go. Also limiting outside involvement, maybe in groups or things like that, as well as using jealousy to justify actions. And when we say jealousy there, Jealousy is something of a normal relationship, but it's an extreme jealousy, justifying abusive actions. At the bottom, we see minimizing, denying, and blaming. This is making light of the abuse and not taking their concerns about it seriously. So the victim's bringing up the abuse, and then that would be the abuser not taking it seriously, and not thinking that it's a problem or that they did anything, or possibly blaming it on them, which is kind of what it says here, shifting the responsibility for the abusive behavior, saying that the victim caused it. Next, it's using children. So this could be making them feel guilty about the children, using the children to relay messages, using visitation to harass the victim, and threatening to take the children away. So next we have using male privilege, and here we just want to emphasize again that in a domestic violence situation, the victim can be a male and it can be a female. It can be both in any domestic violence situation. And so this could be treating the victim like a servant. It could be the abuser making all of the big decisions. It also could be the abuser acting like the master, like of the castle, master of the house, and also being the one to define men and women's societal roles and privilege in general. Next, we have using economic abuse. And so this could be preventing the victim from getting or keeping a job, making the victim ask for money, giving the victim an allowance, also taking the victim's money, not letting the victim know about or have access to the family income, so they just don't know what's going on with money at all. So lastly, using coercion and threats. So this would be making or carrying out threats to do something to hurt the victim. This could be the abuser threatening to leave the victim, the abuser attempting or committing suicide. This also could be the abuser reporting the victim to welfare. Could also be making the victim drop charges and making the victim do illegal things. And so this power and control wheel is illustrated as a circle because there are periods of times where things may be calmer in a domestic violence relationship, but those times are followed up by a build of tension and abuse, which is what Michelle shared in the cycle of abuse. And so these results are usually in the abuser peaking with intensified abuse. And so it's just important to know that abuse often repeats and it becomes worse over time, because as we spoke about in the beginning, nobody goes into a relationship thinking it's going to be domestic violence, and so it's a thing that gradually gets worse over time. And so in every relationship though is different, and it might not follow this exact pattern of this power and control wheel. The abuse may repeat very rapidly, but in others there's a long period of time in between the abuse.
Katie and I will now go over some of the red flags, warning signs of a domestic violence relationship. That may include telling the victim that they can never do anything right, showing jealousy of the victim's family, friends, time spent away from the abuser, accusing the victim of cheating, or just keep discouraging the victim from seeing other people that they care about, right? And the whole point is to isolate them, to have more control. They may embarrass or shame the victim, put them down, control every penny spent in the household, not allowing the victim to really know what's going on with the finances. Perhaps there is looking at or acting in ways that would even scare the person that they are abusing, whether they're physical, like directly physical or not, and controlling who the victim sees, where they go, what they do, how they dress, what their hair might look like, or even if they look nice, trying to intimidate them or accuse them of being a certain way, just because of what they might be wearing that particular day. Also, one to point out is stalking the victim or monitoring their victim's every move. Now, a lot of times we think of doing it physically, But in this day and age, that could be in person, but it can also be via the internet or other devices, such as a GPS tracking device. It could be getting access to someone through their social media. So there are different ways of what stalking can include.
Yeah, nowadays stalking can be many different things, especially with technology.
Absolutely.
But continuing on through the list, some other warning signs are preventing the victim from making their own decision. So this can be like with money, for example, that Michelle already mentioned. Also telling the victim that they're a bad parent or threatening to hurt, kill, or take away their children. This also could be threatening to hurt or kill the victim's friends, loved ones, or pets, intimidating the victim with guns, knives, or other weapons, pressuring the victim to have sex when they don't want to, or doing things sexually that they're not comfortable with. This is like pushing the victim's boundaries. Another thing is forcing sex with other people, refusing to use protection when they're having sex, or sabotaging birth control, as well as pressuring or forcing the victim to use drugs or alcohol. Lastly, preventing the victim from working or attending school, as well as harassing the victim at either work or school and keeping them up all night so they perform badly in their job or school. That's one example. And lastly, just to wrap up some of those red flags and warning signs, destroying the victim's property. So this could be in many ways, but basically damaging anything of the victims to just show that the abuser is in control and they have the power. It's really what they're trying to do is intimidate the victim. Going into talking about the common traits of an abuser, there's no one typical detectable personality of an abuser. And as we've said, no one goes into a relationship thinking it will become abusive. However, we do want to share with you some common characteristics that have been gathered through research of domestic violence relationships. So an abuser often denies the existence or minimizes the seriousness of the violence that's happening and its effect on the victim, as well as other family members who are witnessing this abuse. An abuser also objectifies the victim. They often see them as their property or sexual objects. An abuser also has low self-esteem. They normally feel powerless and ineffective in the world. They may appear successful, actually, but internally they feel inadequate, which is the reason that they're trying to gain power and control over the victim. An abuser also externalizes the causes of their behavior. This is the blaming that we've talked about. They blame their violence on circumstances such as stress, their partner's behavior, on a bad day, alcohol, drugs, and other factors. Also maybe frustrations with pets or children at home. An abuser may often come off pleasant and charming between periods of violence, and they're often seen as a nice person to others outside of a relationship.
Domestic violence affects all aspects of a victim's life. When abuse victims are able to safely escape and remain free from their abuser, it oftentimes makes a huge impact and long-lasting impression on, their physical health, their mental health, their relationship with friends, family, their economic well-being, even their relationship with their children and loved ones. Victims of domestic violence experience all kinds of emotions, and sometimes they pick up ways in which to cope. And victims of domestic violence may also incorporate the following. They may want the abuse to end, but not the relationship, and feel quite isolated and depressed and anxiety and feel helpless and hopeless. They may also be unaware, completely unaware of what services there are out there to help them. They might be very embarrassed and full of shame and not want to go to their friends and family, isolating themselves even more. They might still love their abuser, and very bonded with them in some way. They may be impulsive or aggressive and feel financially dependent on the abuser. They may have no support of friends and family whatsoever and have a lot of fear as to where it is they might live or where their children might live. They may fear cultural or community backlash that might hinder their escape or support, and also somehow live with the stigma of being a domestic violence survivor. They may also be distrustful of local law enforcement or the courts or other systems if the abuse is revealed. So these are just some of the things, some of the reasons why victims of domestic violence either choose to stay in this sort of relationship and just feel this emptiness and this inability to leave. It is not the victim's fault. These are normal ways of coping with a very traumatic and violent and discouraging situation. And unfortunately, it just feeds in to that cycle of domestic violence. So these are some of the many reasons why victims of domestic violence, they do end up choosing to stay in these abusive relationships, or they just simply feel that they're unable to leave. But we want to assure our viewers and our victims and anyone else that you may know, there are exits. There are ways to create a safety plan. There are many resources in the community, and we are here at Casa De La Familia happy to share them with you. Katie?
We would like to provide the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence hotline number, and that is 1-800-799-7233. And that is anonymous confidential help that's available 24/7. And their website that also just has additional information about domestic violence is ncadv.org. And also, Casa de la Familia is here to help anyone who is in need of mental health services. Our phone number is 877-611-2272. This wraps up now a first part of our 4-part series, What Do I Do Now? Steps to Survivor. Next Tuesday at this exact same time, we're discussing Casa de la Familia's domestic abuse response team and how they help victims. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.